Hi, I'm Femioke and you're in the stream. Today, the battle over circumcision, why some doctors say a man's foreskin has to go. So this obviously is a very intimate conversation. Our guest digital producer is Omar Badar today. Omar, with this intimate conversation, is this putting off our online community at all?
Not at all, actually. The response has been quite significant. It really is rare when you see that much of a significant reaction from our online community. So there's a lot of interest in this particular topic. We also put out the question of whether circumcision is a good idea or not, and the range of views that we got in response is actually quite wide. Take a look at my screen here. Abdul Hasib says, circumcision feels great and keeps many infections away, #healthy sex. On the other hand, we have Rose here who says, no, it is a human rights violation. Every human has the right to intact genitals. So those are pretty strong words about this. Of course, for those of you at home, we want you to be part of this conversation. So be sure to tweet in using the #AJStream. And Twitter is not the only way that you can join this conversation. Take a look at my screen here. This is our Facebook page. You can visit it by going to facebook.com/AJStream. Click like and you'll be in the stream.
Hi, my name is Allison West. I'm an online editor and I'm in the stream.
To cut or not to cut? That's the question for men regarding circumcision. Around the world, foreskin removal is done for religious purposes, but also for perceived health benefits. The highest number of circumcisions in the whole world are done in the Middle East and in Africa. So in Zimbabwe, where 1.1 million people are living with HIV, a government campaign is recommending that men and baby boys have the procedure in an effort to stop new infections. Earlier we spoke with the country's Deputy Health Minister, Paul Chimedza.
We feel that scientifically, it's a scientifically sound, proven method of preventing, of reducing the chances of HIV. So that's why we've taken it. And with the multi-sectorial approach that we've used, we've seen our numbers of incidents of new infections coming down. So we're happy that it probably is playing its part in the fight against the HIV.
As the circumcision debate turns into a battle, foreskin pride rallies are being held around the world. Many circumcision opponents worry that the push in Africa will spread to other places.
And although I get involved in the issue in Africa, I'm much more worried about the fact that the African studies and experience will be used to recreate a marketing system for circumcision in the US and halt all the efforts of those of us over the years to bring the circumcision rates down.
Now, this debate that we're having today is not about religious circumcisions. We're not talking about that. We're talking about circumcisions that are done purely for health reasons. And here to help us understand those reasons, in the studio we have Richard Ramai. He's an associate producer, professor at Northeastern University, and he's a Kenyan who's done extensive research on the health impacts of male circumcision. In South Seattle, we have John Geisecker, who you just heard from in our introduction. He's also the executive director of Doctors Opposing Circumcision. Via Skype from Australia, we have Brian Morris. He's a professor emeritus at the University of Sydney. He's the lead author of a new report published in the journal Mayo Clinic Proceedings. And in Zimbabwe, Jessie Majome is a former Deputy Minister of Women's Affairs, Gender and Community Development. Looking forward to this conversation. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Great to have you all. I'm going to start. Hello, everybody. They're in good voice. I think it's going to be a good debate. I'm going to start here on my computer with a public service announcement called Brothers for Life Zambia. This is a pro-circumcision PSA. Check it out.
When I learned about the benefits, I decided I would get circumcised. Firstly, being circumcised reduces your risk of HIV infection by 60%.
And secondly, it reduces the risk of cervical cancer in women. I love my wife.
I love you too, baby.
So I got circumcised for her too.
So that's the PSA for Zambia, encouraging men to be circumcised. Brian, if I was a young man in Zambia and I was watching that PSA, I wasn't quite convinced. How else would you convince me?
Besides the benefits in reduction of HIV, which of course HIV is killing millions of people and will continue to do so unless there's a substantial reduction. In fact, there is evidence now that the programs for the rollout of circumcision in sub-Saharan Africa are being very effective in reducing infections, therefore reducing suffering and deaths. But besides that, there is a reduction in many other important sexually transmitted infections, such as high-risk HPV that causes cancer in both men and their female partners. Cervical cancer is one of the major problems, one of the major cancers worldwide, including, of course, Africa.
Right. So, Brian, you say this like it's a given, like as a young person in Zimbabwe, or Zambia, or South Africa, or Kenya, anywhere across the sub-Saharan Africa where HIV and AIDS is an issue, you sound like everybody knows that circumcision, male circumcision, will stop HIV. How is that possible? How does that work?
Basically, the foreskin is very vulnerable. The inner lining is quite thin and now allows entry of HIV because of receptors and the fact that the membrane is thin, and so the virus enters readily and then enters the bloodstream.
Right.
The foreskin is also subject to tearing, and it really is a vulnerable part of the body, and that's where the HIV enters, and it also traps viruses and bacteria after sex, and so that's one of the other reasons for the widespread infections, not just HIV but other infections as well, bacteria and so forth.
All right, Brian, so you made that case in a very medical way. I'm thinking if I am a young person in Zambia, I might not be quite convinced by that. John, I saw that, just from your body language, you weren't agreeing with what Brian was saying. Why not?
Well, I mean, I have to tell you, I have heard of the research that shows the foreskin is vulnerable, but I want to ask, what about the labia of the female? I mean, is this not the same sort of tissue, and is our next step to start asking women to remove their labia in order to reduce HIV? I think that the push for circumcision in Africa is a horrific danger for women, not just of their labia, but because their men will now think of themselves as invulnerable to HIV. In fact, we already have evidence that young men are saying to young village women who may be naive on this, that because they're circumcised, they don't need to use a condom.
What's the evidence?
Or they're getting circumcised to get rid of the bother of ever having to use a condom. And in that sense, this whole plan is an epidemiological disaster for women.
I totally disagree with that. There is absolutely no evidence to support what John is saying here. In fact, it is not the case at all in sub-Saharan Africa, and I think it is a total mistake to sort of bundle male circumcision and this idea that the foreskin is similar to the woman part in the genitalia. That is totally not the case. The mechanisms are different. The biological evidence, as Brian is explaining here, that causes the foreskin to be so vulnerable to HIV is there. There's a lot of research that has been done with that. There is no evidence in the research that has come out of sub-Saharan African countries where male circumcision is being promoted to prevent millions of men, potential millions of men, from getting infected with HIV. That somehow there is disinhibition in that men get circumcised and so reduce using condoms or changing behavior. We don't have that evidence. Right. It simply does not exist.
Why not put the same money into condoms? And
condoms have been promoted since the 1990s, and we can show that in many countries, all those hundreds of millions of condoms that have been taken into sub-Saharan African countries using a sort of a US model where HIV is transmitted differently, that this sort of pushing condoms in sub-Saharan Africa, what's the rate of use of condoms? For instance, in Zimbabwe, it's very low. Very few people have been using condoms, even though we've been using these promotion tactics the last 20 years.
Okay, gentlemen, take a breath, because this is a public health conversation, and our online community want to jump into it. Omar.
We actually have concerns that echo the concern that John just raised about whether people are misconstruing whether this actually prevents HIV from being transmitted altogether. Rambai says, my understanding is that after circumcision, one can safely have unprotected sex. So that's an example of how these things can be misleading. Ernst here says, now they just say that it reduces the risk of infection, but the damage has already been done, as people already think that they can't get infected from circumcision. And we have this video comment from Zimbabwe. Take a listen.
I believe that here in Zimbabwe, HIV infection and reinfection rates among circumcised men will go up. The people running the campaign have saturated the airwaves and print media with the message, "Get circumcised today," but not the entire story. A large number of men who go through it may become too confident about the protective effects and engage in high-risk sexual behavior. Some women might even find it harder to insist on condom use by their newly circumcised partners.
So, Jesse, what can be done about trying to promote the health benefits of circumcision without misleading people?
Okay, I think it's interesting that John and the last speaker said also what I think, that, the campaign for the circumcision of males, I think, I think it's interesting that there's already evidence that was said by John that it's already been found that somewhere the conduct of, people who've been circumcised is possibly affected, that there's a chance that they might be lulled into a false sense of security, that they will think that they are now immune. That's also my concern, and I think also the last week I didn't get to hear his name, that the messaging around male circumcision is what personally I have a problem with, because this is what I wanted to say, that here in Zimbabwe, the campaign, there's a very visible and a very loud campaign that's for encouraging male circumcision. But I'm concerned that when I see and hear all that messaging, I seem to be getting the message that it's almost saying to men, it's almost one-sided. It's talking about the benefits to the men, about how safe they will be from HIV and AIDS. And because also of experiences where, human beings are very, I suppose, interesting creatures, they tend to find their way around things. And if there's risk around the lack of use of condoms, I think there's even higher risk.
So, Jesse, is this anecdotal? Do you have any
complacency?
Right, Jesse, but is this anecdotal? Is this that you're getting from men in Zimbabwe, that they're now feeling invincible, that they can go off and have sexual encounters with a circumcised penis and feel very comfortable that they're safe from HIV? Is that the feeling you're getting? How do you know that's happening?
I'm not a medical person myself, so I don't know. I'm not a researcher, but what I can say for certain is that the messaging is actually saying that men go and get circumcised. There's even this very big popular advert that's on billboards where it uses the soccer imagery, where all these men are lined up and wearing soccer jerseys, and they're maybe like trying to defend the penalty. And it's really that kind of messaging is one-dimensional. It's to the men. It's almost as if it's saying that it's almost as if it's saying to men that women are the ones that give you AIDS. So protect yourself. Get circumcised so that you don't get any HIV and AIDS from men, and ultimately, ultimately, I think some will feel as if they are safe.
Ms. Majome, we've had the Minister of Health in Zimbabwe, and I recall my visit in Zimbabwe in 2012 in July, during when at the time there was a publication in the media that a journalist had written, basically. Not supportive of circumcision and raising, misreporting, basically. And then, of course, at the time I was visiting the Ministry of Health, there was a meeting to sort of do a damage control. So the reporting, as it is, it has to be accurate. We had
What's
the
the
Minister
problem with
of
the
Health.
Reporting, Richard?
We've had the Minister of Health saying, supporting all the programming that the ministry should be doing, and so the messaging, I agree with you, the messaging has to be done right so that it is not misleading. But misreporting in the media can cause damage. We saw that after this specific news item came out, the members of parliament, Zimbabwean men members of parliament, publicly came out to be circumcised, quite a large number of them. And so that was a good step in showing leadership in this and sort of supporting proper messaging. That has to be well emphasized.
Omar.
So we have some people here online who are disagreeing a little bit. We'll get to you in just one moment. Bay Area Intactivists here says, male circumcision is unnecessary because there are effective non-surgical ways to prevent and treat the rare problems that this is supposed to treat. We also have Uncut Lady Bits here, who says that circumcision is an intervention for problems that a vast majority of men will never experience. Foreskin has over 16 functions. John, I know that essentially whatever you think of the statistics on this, can you just talk a little bit about what you touched on in the pre-show, about what could be the benefits of actually remaining uncircumcised?
Well, sexual sensation for a start. Let's be practical about this. Human reproduction involves the contact of the outer skin of the penis with the internal skin of the female. In an intact male, his foreskin becomes the cover on his penis, and that is the contact surface. It makes perfect sense anatomically and in evolutionary terms that structure was made to be extremely sensitive so it would work quickly and effectively and perhaps frequently. The glans, on the other hand, the little fireman's hat, the pointy end of the penis, is very ill supplied. It has only what are called protopathic receptors, not well connected receptors. It's actually a rather dull surface. I tell audiences that if a woman wants to know how sensitive her man's glands is, she should just touch her earlobe, because that is about the level of sensitivity of a gland.
John,
everybody's touching their earlobe nose to see how sensitive it is.
If it had that sexual function, why would millions of men have been circumcising traditionally for years? Why would whole populations do that if it had any sort of sexual function at all? The evidence, in fact, is not there that it has, significant sexual function that is eliminated because of removing it. There is no such evidence.
Are you circumcised, and were you circumcised at birth?
I was not circumcised at birth, no.
Are you circumcised now?
If I could jump
That is immaterial, John.
No, it's not immaterial. Intact men know what they have. The rate of uptake of adult males for circumcision in cultures other than Zimbabwe is very, very low, like 1 in 500, often done for religious reasons or cosmetic reasons.
No, John, that is inaccurate.
So
that is inaccurate, John.
Gentlemen, let me make a little space for Brian to jump in. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah. Look, I've had enough of this nonsense. There's absolutely no scientific support for what John has just said. He referred to a study in San Francisco funded by NOCIRC, with a raft of anti-circumcision activists on it. We analysed that data, and there is absolutely no statistically significant difference. If you want to look at the best quality studies, you look at the randomised controlled trials, and they've been done, and they show men who are circumcised as adults and then followed for 2 years afterwards for their sexual pleasure, sensitivity, sensation, function, and all the other parameters. There is absolutely no difference statistically, but in fact, there are more men who said sex was better after circumcision.
But this is a bigger conversation than sexual pleasure. It is important, Brian. Brian, it is important, but it's a very old debate, if I may just say this to our guests. It's a very old debate about foreskin, no foreskin, more pleasure, less pleasure. But what seems to be more important is how circumcision is being used in certain countries in Africa and the push to get millions of African men to be circumcised. I just want to keep us on point here for a little bit, because that is a big issue. Jesse, I know you wanted to jump in.
Could I reply to the RCTs for a second, as long as Brian has mentioned them?
I'll come back to you, just because I want to make sure that we don't lose the big picture here. Because if you're trying to circumcise so many millions of men by 2015, that's a big conversation. We don't have much time for this.
We are going to.
So Jesse, let me go to Jesse. Richard, I'll come back to you. Jesse, go ahead.
To the issue of HIV and AIDS, because I think that is the bigger issue here.
Right.
Because in Zimbabwe here, where it's been reported, I don't know about the statistics in other countries, but if there are so many, the uptake of circumcision, voluntary circumcision by men is so much higher. It's interesting that we need to talk about it again in the context that it is being pushed and promoted.
So Jesse, do you feel that circumcision
HIV and AIDS?
Jesse, let me ask you, so do you feel, in your former role, you were Deputy Minister of Women's Affairs in Zimbabwe, so you're very connected to this issue. Do you believe that circumcision in men will be very helpful for preventing HIV spreading?
Like I said earlier, I worry that because of the messaging that is coming along with the circumcision, I worry that circumcision itself, if the messaging goes as it is, without the balance, without still saying to people that, you know what, you can get circumcised, it does contribute to reducing the rate of HIV and AIDS transmission, but you must still continue to abstain, be faithful, use a condom, and that circumcision in itself is not a panacea. If that messaging goes out boldly, I'll be happy. But also, I'm also worried about another dimension. The studies in Zimbabwe have shown that the uptake has increased because the age of the circumcised people has been reducing. There is a target to younger males who are who've just attained adolescence. So
Right.
there, that's another issue that I think that we need to also manage the messaging so that we say the correct things to young men and boys who are just
Jessie, take a breath for a
because they're also
moment.
getting the sex messages.
All right, Jessie, take a breath for a moment. I want to go back to the community in
we
the
actually
closing moments of the program.
Have a video comment real quick from Zachary. Take a listen to this.
Okay.
The benefits of circumcision are overstated, while the risks are understated and underreported. Real doctors use medicine, not tissue removal, to heal patients who are not seriously ill. This isn't 1900. We have a plethora of non-surgical remedies at our disposal. We no longer have to amputate every limb that becomes infected, and we must not amputate healthy tissue that only might cause problems. Circumcision is barbaric, immoral over-treatment. Our bodies, our choice.
I fully disagree with that. First of all, if we even talk about human rights, adult men can determine whether they want to keep the foreskin or not. If I know the benefit of circumcision, then I have a right to make the decision. So somebody to say it's amputation, that is not quite accurate at all. I go back to the role that circumcision is having in sub-Saharan African countries, where 3 randomized control trials were conducted in Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa, showing that male circumcision reduces the risk of HIV infection in heterosexual men by 60%. That evidence,
60%, but that was 60% average over all of those studies.
That is evidence.
Not every time that you have intercourse.
That is evidence as good as you can get in epidemiological studies.
That's the best we have.
That is not evidence.
That's what you're saying,
That
Richard.
is evidence as you can get. We also have observational historical evidence in countries like Kenya, all these other sub-Saharan African countries. So the target and the modeling studies have indicated that we can actually avert 4 million new HIV infections. That's 21% of new HIV cases across sub-Saharan African countries by using a well-tested model of reducing and removing the foreskin, because if you remove the foreskin, you reduce the risk of men getting infected with HIV, but you also reduce the infection in the general population in women.
All right, Richard,
And in-
what I don't
and in
understand.
Zimbabwe, you prevent
Richard, take a breath for a second, because I've got 2 minutes and I'm going to use it very wisely. I don't understand. If you're circumcised as a man, you're still putting a condom on. Why don't you just put a condom on in the first place?
Exactly.
Well, why you don't? Because you know what the rate of condom use is in sub-Saharan African
But you
countries?
still have to
You
use
know
it
what
to
it
have
is?
protection if
You
you're
know what it is
circumcised,
here
right?
here in the US, very few people ever use a
Right.
condom consistently. So we need to do something.
So
That's
for
why we
those
are
little
doing
moments when
studies.
you don't use
That
a
is why-
condom,
yep, that's
you
why
lose your
we are
foreskin.
that's why we are doing studies to test whether there could be a microbicide, a vaginal gel that women can use.
Because
to
men don't
have-
like to wear condoms.
Well, that too. I mean, you know
Right.
how it is. But generally, we know that condom use is very low. So it's the same thing. We can say, why give
But it's not
treatment for
60%
HIV
protection
to
over
reduce
every single sexual intercourse you
can
have.
I just say
So,
something?
gentlemen, I'm going to tell you that the person you're listening to right now, that is Brian Morris. We also have John Geisecker, we have Richard Wamai, and we have Jessie Mujome, and she is an MP in Zimbabwe. This conversation has barely got started. If you've got a laptop, you've got a computer, or you're on YouTube later, go to stream.aljazeera.com. We are going to pick right up where we left off. Meanwhile, I just have time to tell you about the next show. Somalis in Kenya say that they're being treated like criminals in a security crackdown. But can Kenya fight terrorism and respect human rights as well? That is another conversation for another day. Until then, to cut or not to cut, hashtag AJStream. Omar here is waiting for your tweets. We can add them to the conversation. We're taking all of our guests online, and we will see you there. Thanks for watching. Hello again. I'm glad you came to the post show. So much more to talk about. We are discussing the debate over male circumcision. Now, was it John who said he wanted to come back with the RCTs, John?
Yeah.
I don't even know what they are, so help me out so that we're all on the same page here.
It stands for random controlled trials.
Right,
trials,
okay.
The only thing that was random was the participants.
Okay.
And there was definitely a lot of control by the researchers, and it was more like a show trial than a real trial. For one thing, the 60% figure does not rise to the level of an immunization, which must, by standard bioethics, be in the high 90s. A 60% protection of anything is merely a roll of the dice. All that a person is doing who's circumcised and then not bothering to use the usual protections of ABC is playing Russian roulette with that 60% number. The 60% was the difference between
Brian, hold your fire. We hear you, Brian, but let John finish, and John make a point, and then Brian will pick up. Go ahead.
Very quick point. The 60% number was derived by comparing the 2.5% uptake of the intact men and the 1.5% of the circumcised men. It's only a tiny percentage difference, which they've jacked up to be the 60% of those two numbers.
All right, so basically, for us lay people, you're calling the stats into question, Brian?
Okay, start with John. Let's face it, John is a lawyer. He is not a scientist. He is not a doctor. Trials are not about, following people forever and ever. They follow people until they find a statistical difference. In fact, the statistical difference happened so soon that the monitoring body stepped in and stopped the trials because it would have been unethical to continue them, given that the evidence showed such a strong protective effect.
And Brian, I'm just going to stop you for a moment, because I remember covering this many years ago and about the trials in Uganda, and they were doing controlled trials. So some men were circumcised, some men weren't, and they actually stopped the trials, as you said, because the men who were circumcised were actually avoiding being infected with HIV. And they're just like, this is unethical. We don't need to do a control here. Let's just circumcise everybody. So that was the start of the push for male circumcision. All right, don't want to tell your story, but I just wanted everybody to understand how dramatic that was.
I also completely dispute John's misunderstanding of immunology and vaccines. Vaccines have a variable effect. Some are, as John did say, quite effective. But look at one of the most common vaccines, the flu vax. The effectiveness of that at the population level is about 80%, which is also about the effectiveness of condoms. And with the long-term follow-up of the HIV trials and the rollout, the protective effect of circumcision has risen over the years, so it's now approaching that 80% mark. And in public health, we advocate multiple interventions, not just condoms, not just circumcision, but also behavioural factors and anything else that we can show does work. We don't say, we'll just go this way because we like it. We use all of the effective methods, and circumcision is one of the most effective. And as Richard pointed out, condoms tend not to be used. But once a man is circumcised, he's circumcised for life, and that's significant. Condoms have to be put on the penis before any sexual contact, including foreplay. But very important that they are promoted.
All right, so Brian, take a pause for a moment. We hear very clearly what you're saying, but everybody else is going to jump in. So you've made a fantastic point. We understand you. Sorry to cut you off for a moment, just so we can get everybody in there. Here, Jessie, what did you want to add?
Unfortunately, the messaging around the campaigns for circumcision are not as clear as Brian is sounding. They are not, it's not coming out as clearly that the circumcision must be done contemporaneously with the other measures. I wish they would be as clear as he is, then there'd be no problem. But
Jessie, that's to do with isn't that to do with your administration, your health minister, and all of the health professionals in Zimbabwe?
Jessie too. Well, I mean, in Zimbabwe,
because can I just say that you see what we are not saying anything about the men who are HIV positive and who are actually getting circumcised themselves. I don't seem to hear any, because there is a very, like in Zimbabwe, there's a very high level of prevalence of HIV, HIV. So everybody's getting circumcised, and then there are men who also have that. And are also things, more or less like they would get tested, but the idea, the communication is really very, very important.
Okay,
And
all
also
right.
the young
So Jessie,
people
you
who
made
are
that. Jessie, we're going back to points that you made earlier in the main show. So thank you for reiterating them, but we'll go over them in detail again. Omar.
We actually have a different concern, just to switch gears a little bit, being raised online. We have OJ here who says you cannot deny that circumcision the African way is not safe, and this is from what they have seen and heard in Uganda, and even somewhat recently, I think it was about a month ago or so, we heard the story from Memphis, where even in the United States there was a case where a circumcision went wrong and a baby had their entire penis severed, essentially. Do you have a sense of whether this is common and whether it happens sometimes in tribal areas where it's not done safe or the right way? How common a problem is this?
It is not common. It is common. This is not common at all. The randomized control trials had very low adverse events, and most of them, 0.+%, very low, and most of them non-severe at all. It's not common at all, and it has to be emphasized. Jazeera is in Zimbabwe, and so this program to reach 20 million men in these 14 countries is voluntary, number one, and it is medical. So it's being done by highly trained teams. It's being done by highly trained teams. And Jesse, I was very impressed to learn this morning that in Zimbabwe last year, you reached 112,000 new circumcisions. And I know that in Zimbabwe, the key barrier has not necessarily been about messaging and communication, because the Ministry of Health material that I have seen from Zimbabwe seems to be clear that condoms also are emphasized, not just that therefore that once a man is cut, he is fully and the partner is fully protected. I'm impressed that Zimbabwe is increasing training
on the ground.
Richard, there's a couple of things that Jessie's saying. One is it doesn't count for infants. Infants are not voluntarily circumcised against their will. And she's also saying that's not what she sees on the ground. You're based in Boston.
Quite right.
Jessie's in Zimbabwe,
Quite right. But Jessie, some Zimbabwean researchers have recently published, majority of Zimbabweans support infant circumcision. 69% support infant circumcision. Did you ask the infants? 69% support infant circumcision.
Right, Richard, take a breath. I feel that you've added a lot to the conversation. Let me go to the online community
we
as well.
We actually have that particular debate being had online as well. We have Sibusiso here who says that it's better to do the circumcision at birth because there are less chances of complications. On the other hand, we have Charlie here on Facebook who says, I'm circumcised, but I wish I hadn't been. I should have had the right to make an informed decision about my body rather than having an unwanted body modification forced on me. John, what do you say to that?
I agree with it. I agree with it entirely. By the way, I agree with I believe it was Brian who said that adults can choose. No, it was Dr. Wamai who said that adults can choose. Our physicians group does not oppose voluntary male circumcision at all. I mean, adult males can do whatever they please with their body. What we're strenuously opposed to is circumcising young boys and infants against their will on the theory that this is the best kinds of epidemiology. It is not. It's human rights abuse, pure and simple.
What about vaccination for immunization for children, John?
Vaccination aids the body. It doesn't remove anything.
So does male circumcision.
Okay, one at a time. So let's do Brian, go ahead, just briefly, because we're running out of time here.
Okay, vaccination and circumcision are similar. I mean, John mentioned human rights, or someone did, but the right of a child to good health far supersedes, theoretical and other considerations.
Right.
Brian, you know I'm a New Zealander where we don't have circumcision, and we were just elected the world's #1 most socially progressive country. They have not had circumcision there of anybody since the 1960s, and they have low STD rates and low HIV. There is this notion that somehow you can forcibly circumcise children for health reasons is absolutely ludicrous.
That is not correct.
There are some very good studies from New Zealand that have shown a substantial reduction in sexually transmitted infections in circumcised men. These are longitudinal studies.
If you're talking about Ferguson, it's already gone.
Okay, gentlemen, once we start getting into studies, I know that I need to start wrapping up the conversation. But Jessie, I know, because you're scaring me. But Jessie, let me go back to you, because I know you'll take us back to grassroots for Zimbabwe. What did you want to add?
So you know what? I wanted to also maybe focus on the drive to circumcise adolescent boys who are just about 13 years old and above. Again, my issue goes back to messaging again, because the increase in Zimbabwe has been because there's been a bigger focus on those. But again, the messaging, in my view, I'm not happy with it. It's not responsible.
All right, Jessie, you've made this point several times and beautifully. So I'm going to wrap up now. Richard, I know you have more to say. And John and Brian, I know you have more to say. But before we go, we will take this conversation online. It has a lot of energy here. Before we go, I have to show you something on my laptop, because if we're talking about circumcisions, I'm sure a lot of people are thinking about a medical procedure. But now what's being rolled out is something that actually isn't necessarily medical. It's known as a non-surgical procedure. So this device here rolls on a band, and then this device here rolls back the foreskin. That keeps it in place, and in about 2 weeks the foreskin kind of dies of its own accord. And in order to decide the right ring, you have a ring sizer, rather like you might have if you're going to go off and buy yourself a ring. And that's how a lot of these mass circumcisions are taking place. So I wanted to give you that little foreskin factoid. Richard is dying to say some more, but I'm going to leave the last word to the community. Omar, what are you going to take us out with?
A couple of closing tweets here. James says, in third world countries like Kenya, circumcision is used to mitigate the spread of HIV and AIDS. Sexual pleasure is a first world issue. And we have Zach here finally, who says, cut or not, everyone will benefit from hygiene, medical care, safer sex practices, including the use of condoms as adults.
Yes. I salute you. You are wonderful. Richard Wamai, John Gaisheka, Brian Morris and Jessie Majome, thank you very much for being part of this conversation. That debate will continue, I'm sure, in feisty fashion online. On the next show, Somalis in Kenya say that they're being treated like criminals in a security crackdown. But can Kenya fight terrorism and respect human rights at the same time? Big conversation, but big conversation for another day. Until then, see you online. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.